Hello guys, David Vos here. What a beautiful day it is. It's hot, but it's going to rain this afternoon. And it should start sprinkling actually any moment. Within an hour or two, it's going to start raining a little bit. But I hope you're having a wonderful day. Guys, I want to do this as a part two to that video we did a couple days ago, which I'm very sad that very few people even watched. This is such critical, amazing information. And it feels like very few people are watching. But I am encouraged because I have gotten a couple of messages, people letting me know that they have watched these videos, that they're really interested, that they're paying attention. And so it seems like there is a group of individuals that watch these videos that are getting something out of it. And maybe that's the core constituency that we're trying to find here. The Lord knows what he's doing, but I'll tell you, if it gets down to where only about 150 people are watching, or 10 people or whatever, I don't know. Let's hope it doesn't come down to that. But I really hope and wish that we could share this with as many as possible. Let people know that you've got to watch a little of this to really understand it. You can't just jump into this. A nominal Christian would balk because, by the way, a few of the things they're going to say today, a lot of these nominal Christians would balk. Well, let's jump right in here with what we were talking about. We were talking about the sacrament in a couple of videos back, and this is part 2. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 2, verse 13. When the disciples get this rushing wind of the Ruach, and then they began speaking in these tongues, Glossolalia, the scripture uses that Greek word. And there were mockers in the crowd who said they are filled with new wine. Now, isn't that interesting? They're not filled with old wine, they're filled with new wine. And we talked about what the new wine was the other day. The Greek word there is glucose. It's glucose. It's sugar. They're filled with the sweet, sugary grape juice. New. It ain't fermented, you see. But it may have to do with something that's not grapes at all, like we were saying before. How could these Nazarite priests that were not allowed to drink any wine or eat flesh, why is it Jesus comes along and changes this festival, this feast, and says, we're not going to eat the lamb no more, I'm the lamb. And we're going to eat a type of bread that he adds honey to. And he said, I'm not going to drink of the vine no more until I drink it with you. New wine in the kingdom. Now, a few days later, Jesus meets them, and they're drinking some new wine, and it's got honey, and he adds fish. And wait till you find out about the reason they use honey and fish, because the Catholics were doing this years and years and years after this, centuries. And they were vegetarians, and yet they would partake of the bee honey and fish, even though it wasn't it wasn't meat. They didn't believe in eating meat, but they would partake of fish, just as the Nazarites would, because they were all Nazarites. The Knights of St. John were a knighthood or a priesthood of this Nazarite ilk. But the Greek word is glucose. It is a completely different word from onios, which is the common fermented wine. And so glucose, that's the modern word we have, glucose. It means a hyper-sweet, unfermented, first press syrup of the fruit. And then Peter fires back in chapter 2, verse 15, Acts 2:15. He said, these people are not drunk, as you suppose, for it's only the 3rd hour of the day, about 9 a.m. So Peter's defense reveals that there is some kind of paradox here that we've noted. How can a person be physically fully filled with the unfermented, non-alcoholic glucose, sweet juice, and yet they act so physically ecstatic or shouting and speaking in some weird language, and a crowd assumes that they're all intoxicated? Peter must be confirming that this frenzy is not from common chemical alcohol or yayin, but a profound spiritual or alchemical awakening that we might speculate has two causes: some spiritual deep revelation within the person, or was it a opening of the eyes when they drank or ate the honey? Because when Jesus gave them the honey and they broke the bread, their eyes were open. That is a physical, or a literal, I should say, term in the Bible, in the old ancient languages. When they said their eyes were open, it didn't just mean that they had a revelation. It meant, especially when you partook of the honey and then your eyes were open, it meant that you had partaken of the Kykeon, which is the sacrament from the Essenes up at Artemis's temple. And it was made from barley or rye or wheat, and it was made from the honey of the daffodil. And it opened your eyes, I guarantee it. So, we have to note something else. It was Pentecost when this was going on. Pentecost is the bridal wedding feast. That's what it is. No, I don't think most people even realize that. But it was the wedding at Sinai to start with, and here it is, the Christian wedding. So in the Old Testament, Shavuot, which is Pentecost, was 50 days after the Exodus. Well, that's Passover, right? So Passover happened, Jesus died, 50 days later they had Pentecost, and boom, they had a wedding. Well, it was the day that Yahweh came down to Sinai to hand over the Torah. And the Jews and their mystical Jewish faith viewed this as a marriage covenant. Well, all Jews believe that. The Torah was the wedding contract. It was called the Kedubah. It was between Yahweh and Israel. Israel married Yahweh at the Kedubah. So in the Gospels, Jesus meets the woman at the well who had 5 husbands, which represents the 5 books of the physical Torah. So she had been under the law, and she was abused, I guarantee it. And she was a slave. And the husband she had then wasn't her husband. So she was a widow, just living with somebody. This is the same woman that was accused of adultery. She is Mary Magdalena because she was over the tower, the priesthood, a holy woman that the Jews always translated that word holy. In those cases, they turned it around and made it a harlot, a prostitute. This is where we get the idea that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. She wasn't a prostitute. She was a holy woman, or of the Ariel's Gamos great wedding, and they did some very interesting traditions there. So, Jesus promised her living water at the well. Right after that, he liberated her from the adultery or the carnal law that she had been accused of, that her religion was false. And then it goes towards this wedding. 50 days later, Jesus marries her at the wedding at Cana. She was the Canaanite woman. So for 50 days after the resurrection, Jesus appears in his immortal spiritual light body. Wasn't yet completely ascended. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but he says, touch me not, because he hadn't gotten finished with his transitioning into the purely energetic, non-tangible form. But Pentecost is the day that the groom, which is the Christ consciousness, finally merges into the womb of the disciples' waiting minds. pouring out the glucose to finalize the marriage in the spirit and the truth. Remember, weddings, Arios Gamos, it's literally written, Arios Gamos, in your Bible. We just translated the wedding, and we're all getting our white robes. We're all going to the wedding, right? It's the marriage supper of the Lord. And that's where we get the sacrament. I guarantee it, because at Pentecost, they had the sacrament, and their eyes were opened. But they had already begun every 8th day partaking of the sacrament. And the idea of the 8th day is Sunday, because there's 7 days in the week, and then the 8th day is the first day of the week, the Sunday. Easter is on Sunday. Pentecost is on the 50th day, always on a Sunday. Because Jesus met them on the 8th day, and 8 days later, he met them again, and they kept breaking the bread and eating the honey, and their eyes were open until Pentecost, and they began speaking tongues. What were they eating? Well, the Bible tells you it was honey, melissai. This is the priesthood. And the Essenes, this is the priesthood. And we know what they did. They drank the Kykeon, which is a honey that was used in conjunction with the rye and the wheat. And they made a drink out of it. And so it wasn't the old wine, it was the new wine. The unburned fruit, raw seeds of the Pentecost harvest, because they were having the harvest so that they were able to eat fresh vegetables and fruits. Passover time, you're still, it wasn't harvest time, so you didn't have all this fruit. It wasn't ripe. Well, right after Passover, they wave the first ripe of the fruits, which is the barley leaf. So there's where the barley comes in. And Jesus was the first ripe fruit. He was the barley wave sheaf. They counted some more days until they got to Pentecost, and they all had a big harvest. If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, the Hebrew word for fruit, you shall eat the fruit of the tree, is PR or peri, which, as we've noted, is the phonetic root of fruit, pear, prune, berry, apricot, lots of different words. So deity gives the fruit with the seed. The seed contains the immortal blueprint of life, and it never spoils. So when the human beings grind the wheat, the barley, or the rye into any of the seeds, into white flour, or ferment grapes into rotten alcohol, they're applying human processing, which rots and loses the nutrients. Therefore, what they ate was lachem. Lachem. Cham means burned, and la is the definite article. It's the burned. Lachem, the Arabs translate that meat because you had to cook and process meat. The Jews primarily used it for bread, but it literally means the processed, cooked, dead food. But here we are eating the new, not the dead, but the new, fresh foods. Well, that doesn't mean we're not going to ferment them. There's 2 different kinds of leaven. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. That's the Passover. The flat, unleavened bread. But fruit is bubbling with fungus. All fruits will present this fermentation immediately, within days. If you've got some grapes and you lay them around somewhere within a week, they're going to be fermenting. And you're going to get drunk. But this wasn't grapes. This was something else. So they began to grind the wheat into flour. And then, so they ate the raw, fresh harvest of pomegranates, figs, and they used pomegranates heavily because it's very red. Figs and fresh grain. And then the curse of the thistle is bypassed, and the sacrament becomes a literal sharing of living light energy. Now, there's another theory, and that is that it's an alternative theory, and that is that the secret history of the Essenes, Pythagoras, and the Melchizedek priesthood converges. And if the glucose wasn't just grape juice, it's an explicit chemical formula modeled after the ambrosia of the deities, the food of the immortals. And it has to do with the bee priesthood at Ephesus, the temple of Artemis, Diana, same thing. Artemis of Diana, they call it in the Bible, at Ephesus was governed by Essene priests. Yeah, that's the same Essenes that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they were a different group in a different area. But they were priests, Essene-style priests called the Melissae bees. And the drones. Essene means the drone bee. Melissae means the queen bee and the queen virgins. So they didn't drink common wine at all. But they had mastered the art of beekeeping and sacred botany, and they took these honey combs that they would gather from the area which was covered in daffodils, and it made a very crazy mad honey. And here's the interesting thing about it. It was called narcissus. The daffodil was called the narcissus. This is where we get narc and narcotics and so forth. And this is what's really going to be interesting. Daffodils are related to lilies. They contain alkaloids, glantamine, and licorine. When bees gather nectar from the specific flower, the daffodil, the rhododendron, and some other flowers that I don't remember the names right now, they produce a very highly specific psychoactive honey. It's interesting, but when the bees land on the Jimson weed that we have growing around here where I live, they also make a mad honey. Ha ha ha, oh buddy. So the pomegranates and the mead blend. In ancient Greek and the Near Eastern esotericism, mixing the specific honey with fermented pomegranate juice, which is not grapes, or sacred grain, the Kykeon, created the drink, which literally induced glossolalia. They called it glossolalia. In the scriptures, the speaking in tongues is the Greek word glossolalia, but it's the same word that they use up there at Artemis with these same Essenes. And they spoke in tongues there, and they had visions, and it's the same word. And they did it by means of this sacred sacrament. So they prophesied and had visions, which is exactly like the behavior recorded by Paul in Corinthia and Ephesus. So these are the two theories, and they're not in conflict because they're two sides of the same golden coin. Whether the new wine was the raw, uncorrupted juice of the fresh harvest, which I believe that is important in this scenario, to eat the fresh fruit and vegetables we get in the summer. That's the good part, right? We don't want that old leavened bread or the meat. What we would prefer is the fruit, but it doesn't come out until summer. And that's when we have the wedding, and hallelujah, right? So it's also an advanced herbal nectar of the bee priesthood, the bee priesthood. So it was designed to completely replace the old system of death. The true Arios Gamos, or the Sacrament, remember they have a cake that you eat at a wedding. There's always a wedding cake, and the bride and groom, they have wine, and everybody sits around the table and drinks wine and makes toasts. Well, the wine in the cake is the sacrament, but it's not wine. It never was wine. Something else. It's a new kind of wine. Remember Jesus at the wedding changed the water into wine. Well, it wasn't, you don't change water into wine and get grape wine. It's another kind of what they called the new wine, or a different wine. It was better. It was a better festival. So they discarded the fermented wine, which was of decay, and the slaughter of lambs and the carnal law, and they took the uncorrupted glucose, the high-frequency liquid light of the universe. The human brain stems are illuminated by this very glucose. We step right out of the drunkenness and the blind carnal night of the world. We eat the living seed of the Word and wake up on the holy mountain as the conscious children of day. Now, there is a connection then between the Melissae, which are bees of Ephesus, and the Hebrew name Deborah. Did you know that Deborah literally means bee and word? The book of Revelation describes eating the little scroll that tastes as sweet as honey in the mouth, but bitter in the stomach. Ho, 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 buddy. Yeah. So I had always wondered about Deborah, the mother of Israel. I believe she was a high priestess at Bethlehem, Ephratah, which I believe was Dendera, Egypt, the temple of Isis, Aphrodite, Cleopatra. It was originally built by Miriam. Miriam is the original Mary, or the original was Eve, but Semiramis, or Miriam, it's the same thing, Mary. But Deborah taught Samuel, Gideon, perhaps maybe Samson, Hercules, same thing. And by extension, King David, who was taught by Samuel. Samuel was the deity, they called it a deity, that the woman of Endor brought up from the dead. So, the woman was the mother queen of Israel, Deborah, the queen of Israel, the Sophia teacher. She taught under the palm tree, which is the tree of life, and on a holy mountain, or a holy grove, a natural temple. Maybe the trees of Mamre or other sacred grove. Was a grove, the term grove, related to a grave? Yes, we'll find out it is. That's why it's graveyards are holy. Anyway, graves are funerals and weddings are the two sacred sacraments, funerals and weddings. And Deborah was the queen bee, and she is the bee hive in the summer solstice that is married to the Leo, or the regal star that's up there in Leo. The beehive is up in Cancer, the summer solstice. So it's related to the Greek Cassiopeia, Cepheus, Andromeda, and Perseus. So the Andromeda Perseus story is the divine father mother whose house the married couple will live up in the top of the wheel in the summer, at the summer solstice, at the top of the mountain, which is where all these stories come from, where El is on his mountain and he's got two brothers that are fighting, and one he throws down off the mountain, and that's where the stars fall at the fall equinox. They fall and they go down into the darkness, and they go through the dark night of the soul to learn the knowledge of good and evil, and to conquer the beast, and to free the woman, which is the flesh. And then they get to go back to the top at the wedding in the Father's kingdom, which is, by the way, it's in a sense ruled over by a divine virgin who gives birth to all this thing. But this wedding happens at the time of Pentecost. And Andromeda and Ishtar ride the beast, which is Capricorn, at the bottom of the wheel, through the Aquarius, Pisces water to the spring. So yes, the deities all drank ambrosia. They lived forever. But they claimed it was because, see, there was no difference between the deities and the humans, the mortals. The only difference was the mortals were eating regular food. They were eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that opened their eyes, but it opened both of their eyes. So the woman's eyes was opened first. That's the conscious mind. She gave also to her husband, and his eyes became open. So it's a thing where you split yourself so that your conscious mind can go down through the world and partake of knowledge, because the spirit can't go down in through here, because the spiritual mind is never deceived. Adam was not deceived, but Eve was thoroughly deceived. So this is why she's here. She's learning good from evil. And the only thing that can learn good from evil is the conscious mind. So the deities drank some liquid that they called ambrosia, and it made their blood that was in their veins go away, and it became a golden liquid. So we talked about the man who originally did that and became a deity, Hercules, Samson. Well, there's a lot of very interesting stories about Samson, but he is of the lineage of the Melchizedek priesthood, the Zadokite Nazarite line. He never cut his hair. He had all these powers. This is this golden lineage that had these secrets. So the golden liquid is also similar to the golden liquid. It's in the book of Zechariah and Revelation that goes up the candlestick, the olive oil, and lights the candles or the chakras, the 7 candles. And so also Jesus had no blood after the resurrection. He said, touch me, a spirit doth not have flesh and bones. That's the only time in the Bible that that expression is used. Everywhere else is flesh and blood. The Bible says specifically that flesh with its blood cannot inherit the kingdom, but flesh without its blood. But you must partake of something to make your eyes open, to have enlightenment, and to receive immortality. And that is a drink. It's called the sacrament. So we can track Deborah, the queen bee, from the Bible, which is the alignment of the summer solstice and the golden liquid of the deities, and all these questions and ideas that we have here. We can track it to some clean living that crosses over into some supernatural psychoactive transformation. So we have Deborah, whose name literally means bee. And in ancient astrology, the constellation of Cancer contains the famous star cluster known as Praecipi. Praecipi is the beehive cluster. Cancer is the exact placement of the summer solstice in the ancient world. It's the peak of the sun's light and the height of the summer honey harvest. It's when you harvest the honey in the summer. Right next to Cancer is Leo on the right side, the regal sign of the king star Regulus. When the sun passes from the beehive Cancer into the lion Leo, it represents the cosmic marriage of the queen bee Deborah, Sophia, and the solar king David, Solomon. And this is why Deborah rules under the palm tree of Deborah, or the tree of life, between Ramah and Bethel. Now that's interesting too. We talked about that the other day. Bethel means the house of El. Well, there was a place called Ramah where Deborah, the great teacher, was teaching the prophets. And this was a place where the prophets dwelled. Ramah is where I live. The closest town to me, 23 miles from my cabin, is Ramah, New Mexico. It's the most beautiful place in all the world. I showed you pictures the other day with the craggy mountains. Looks like Sedona with a beautiful lake and a wildlife refuge and beautiful homes. And it's just beautiful. So we live right here in Ramah. Now, the settlers that came into this area were Mormon settlers. They named it that for a reason. But the palm tree is the cosmic axis, which the spine. And the woman sits at the top of the mountain, or the spine, as the Sophia teacher, directing the heroes, Barak, Samson, Gideon, on how to conquer the lower animal forces. Now, we mentioned the grove and the grave etymology. And the word grave in the Germanic language, in the roots of that language, means to dig or to cut out. A sacred grove was a place that was cut out from the forest for a natural temple. And it was also a grave that was dug out for a burial. And both represent the ultimate portal points of life, weddings and transitions and funerals. So they are literally related. And there's so many of these words that are related in our language and then no longer means what they originally were. So in our Bible, we have a lot of words that today don't mean what they were originally to mean. So when we see grave, we don't know this is a sacred place, a grove, a sacred grove. And that, remember Charles Russell died wearing a Roman toga in a graveyard on October the 31st on Halloween night. So he may have had some crazy ideas up his mind. But the deities drank ambrosia. Their veins were filled with a golden liquid, not blood. In the Greek, that was called ichor. And so the gods had ichor running through their blood or their veins. Now, Homer, which is a poet, an ancient Greek prophet, basically, he said that the deities do not bleed red blood because they do not eat the heavy mammalian meat or the fermented bread of mortals, but they consume only the liquid light. Remember, the liquid light is fruit, because fruit absorbs the light. Fruit was made on the third day, right? And the sun was the first thing that the Lord made. Let there be light. And that light was then absorbed right into the fruit. And when we eat the fruit, we're literally eating liquid light. And so your blood is made red and looks what it does. Its constituents are from what you eat in your digestive tract. Everything goes in your mouth and in your stomach literally is digested, goes right into your veins. It becomes your blood. So if we eat differently, our blood changes its consistency. And if we don't eat red meat and dead food, our blood will eventually purify and become a golden liquid. And you become immortal. And this is what the Bible says, and this is what Homer says. So there was a mortal who drank the ambrosia and became a deity. That's Hercules, which in our Bible is Samson. He was brought to Olympus, and he was granted full immortality by consuming this divine nectar. The golden fluid, ichor, is the exact macrocosmic equivalent of the pure olive oil that's burning inside the 7-branch menorah, the golden candlestick that's in the temple. The candlestick is a map of your spine and the 7 chakras. And when your inner candlestick was fueled by the golden, uncorrupted energy, not the red blood, carousel, adrenaline, predator, fear liquid, but then it has this golden liquid, and that carnivore nature ceases to dominate your body. The ultimate question is, and it asks whether this transformation is caused by just eating a pure diet of fresh fruit and raw, unlimited seeds, unmilled seeds, or if it requires a high-potency, psychoactive LSD-style entheogen. The ancient mysteries do reveal that it's a 2-stage, all-chemical process. It's not just one aspect that causes this. There's 2. Stage 1 is the clean diet. That's the foundation. If you switch to a pure living diet of unkilled fruit, the day 3 plants, and the raw, unspoiled, remember, raw food comes from the sun, raw, ray, the rays of the raw. So that's why we call it raw, and that's what your body is supposed to eat, raw fruits and vegetables and nuts. No, I don't think you should eat raw meat, but see, technically, we probably shouldn't eat meat at all. So, and even if you ate fish, you could put it out on a rock and sunbake it. You know, instead of burning it, you can just infuse it with the sun. You can make jerky and other things with the sun. The sun is how many people used to bake their bread even. And you can make sun-baked bread. And it's even better than the kind you put in the oven. So then you stop flooding your body with these hormones of animal terror. When you're killing an animal, it goes right into the cortisol into your body. Cellular decay and chemical toxins that you eat. Your red blood literally purifies your nervous system and it calms down. The curse of the thistles and the thorns and the labor drops away from your cells. It's a critical foundation because it turns your physical body into a perfectly clean, stable stone water jar like they had at Cana. So a clean diet by itself only restores you to a healthy, natural, earthbound state. It doesn't automatically cause you to fly past the archons. So that's where you come into stage 2, the fire of the nectar, which is the trigger. To trigger the explosive ecstatic glossolalia, the tongues, the visions of the zodiac, and the sudden realization of the Christ within, the mystery schools introduced the Sacrament catalyst. This is where the ergot, LSD, rye bread, barley, and wheat bread theory, and the narcissus, or the daffodil, that's what they called it, narcissus, a daffodil narcissus honey comes into play. When the body is already highly purified from a raw diet, Introducing a precisely calibrated sacred entheogen does not cause a bad trip. It doesn't make carnal madness, but it instead acts as a chemical key that overrides the default survival setting of the human brain. It fires the electric energy straight up the spine, the caduceus. It blows open the pineal and the crown chakras, crushing the serpent's head. It temporarily allows the 5 human senses to perceive the unmediated raw day 4 light of the stars. So the ancient prophets, the Nazarenes, the Essenes, did not choose between a raw diet and the spiritual chemistry. They combined them. The raw fruit and the living seeds kept their temples clean, while the high-grade honey-infused glucose, or the new wine, and the sacredly prepared bread served as the explosive alchemical fuel. Together, these 2 elements transform their biological processes, and it's allowed them to shift their consciousness completely out of the carnal flesh, taste the immortal ambrosia of the spirit, and realize their eternal identity as the morning stars. So, gluten is a group of proteins that are found primarily in wheat, barley, and rye. Wheat includes all varieties and derivatives such as spelt, kamut, farro, durum, einkorn, kauskas. So I would prefer eating the einkorn or the spelt. Those are more ancient than the modern wheat that we have. But that's what we should do. We should eat the einkorn. The barley, you can choose barley, or you can choose the rye, which is also basically an ancient grain. And I think the rye works best for fermenting. And then there is a triticale. It's a newer hybrid grain, but we don't care much about that one. But really just the 3, wheat, barley, and rye. And like I said, wheat is the precursor, and all the varieties, spelt, kamut, farro, durum, einkorn, and kokus, and kauskus. And so grains that don't have the gluten are oats, rice, corn, millet, sorghum, teff, amaranth, quinoa, buckwheat. It's not really a wheat, it's a seed. But those are all very healthy, good grains, but they don't have the gluten, which actually, you don't have to have the gluten to be healthy. But I'm just telling you that real gluten is good for you, but you have to use it properly. The gluten that's in the bread nowadays, your white bread, you cannot process that gluten because it doesn't have fiber and all the minerals and nutrients. So a narcissus, or a daffodil, which is what narcissus is a daffodil. It's where we get the word narcotics. The Greek root narc means numbness or stupor. The flower, narcissus, the daffodil, because the herb, the fragrance of the herb could cause a hypnotic state, and the bulbs could cause numbness. They used it when they were trying to heal. So a drug or a narcotic is a substance that dulls the senses, induces sleep or numbness. In the mid-20th century, Americans began using this word narc as a short for narcotic officer, because the American narc and the British narcs sounded identical. Both involved policing the underworld. The 2 words blended together in a popular slang. By the time the war on drugs ramped up, narc had expanded to mean both a drug officer and a general snitch. So, the word narcissist comes from the exact same Greek root word. In Greek mythology, a narcissus is the hunter known for being so very beautiful. And he had a curse. He rejected everyone who loved him. And as punishment from the deities, he was cursed to fall in love with his own reflection in the pool of water. Unable to leave the beauty of his own image, he starved to death at the water's edge. In the very spot where he died, the narcissus flower, or the daffodil, bloomed. So in 1898, the British psychologist Havelock Ellis used the term narcissus to describe a psychiatric condition involving excessive self-absorption. But all these words have to do with each other. So I believe this goes back to something deeper. A narcissus is a flower that made humans deities. At the least, it gave the sacrament. At Ephesus, ecstatic speaking, glossolalia, frenzied dancing, and the gnosis of self and the trip to a spiritual awakening. It was originally a secret only for initiated. In 394, the Goths took Rome, and Arianism was coming into play. The law, the one church, the order, they burned down the Alexandrian library, they put out the holy flame, canceled the rites of the Vestal Virgins and the Flamens. They got rid of the Rex Sacrorum. There would be no more king of the sacred rites. They got rid of the whole priesthood. They began policing the religions. They called them witches' brews. They forbade the sacrament and the speaking of tongues. So the Cathars that were persecuted, or the Gnostics, were wiped off the face of the earth. They were the ones that today we see the stories. They were witches, wizards and witches, wise men and wise women. Actually, they wore white robes, but there might have been groups that wore black robes, but they made potions or they used herbs. That's what this was from. And we're going to talk all about that. We're going to figure all this out. But they canceled the Vestal Virgins and the Flamens. They forbade the sacrament. So the temples, the ancient temples, were turned into Catholic churches, churches of the saints. And I wonder if the church ever made a papal decree that outlawed the sacrament, which would be, in my opinion, the date for the apostasy, the taking away of the daily sacrifice. And what was the placing of the disgusting thing? Maybe entering the holy temple and setting up the golden calf or the bank system, the Torah, or possibly the current sacrament of bread and fermented alcohol wine of the grape. Outlawing grace, spirit, prophecy, tongues, love feasts, no more all things common, but a wicked priest took over. They brought a descendant of Jeconiah that they got from Baghdad, who married Charlemagne's aunt, to create a bloodline of popes. So the Inquisition was the bloody sacrifice of the dog going back to its vomit. The law, slavery, buying and selling, instead of the all things common of the original church, banning the original groups like the Essenes at Artemis and the eunuchs and virgins. Also, I wonder if the Flamen priests were called Flamens because the early church had flames of fire on their head. We'll prove that that's actually true. But if the government banned narcissus, the Jesuits or the Inquisitors would be like narcs, busting up any unauthorized live festivals using narcissus, or the daffodil, and supposed demonic activity and witchcraft. I note that the stories of witches brew and spells and people in black robes making potions like sacraments, maybe modern drug trafficking, comes from the same policing of the Catholic inquisitors. It may go back, and it stems from the Holy Roman Church to stamp out the Cathars. So, the connection that we've made of the narcissus to the ancient mystery schools is historically profound, and it's absolutely the truth. Homer, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, it is a narcissus flower planted by Earth that lures Persephone down into the underworld. The foundational myth of the Eleusinian Mysteries. That Eleusinian Mysteries was in Greece. It is the Elisha Mysteries, just like the Dionysian cult. So modern schools, certain individuals, like you can read Carl Rook, Brian Muraresku, in their Divine Story, they argue that ancient secret societies used psychoactive potions like Kykeon to introduce death and rebirth experiences. Glossolalia, speaking in tongues, and the ultimate gnosis, self-awakening. The alkaloid properties of the narcissus bulb are highly narcotic and toxic. And if you prepare it properly, it was part of the secret formula. As we pointed out, in 394, the Goths historically aligned perfectly with the turning point of Western civilization. Theodosian, the Roman emperor, in around 394, made the Nicene Christianity the only legal religion. He officially banned the Eleusinian mysteries, extinguished the Vestal Virgins, the sacred fire, outlawed the Rex Sacrorum, king of the sacrifice, and criminalized all pagan rites, which were not pagan. They were just not Jewish. Anything that's not Jewish is pagan, you see. The nations. But if it's Jewish, we're not Jews, right? But this is where it's gotten all mixed up. The Library of Alexandria, around 391 AD, the Serapeum, a sister library in Alexandria, was destroyed by the mob led by Christian bishop Theophilus. So that was a great apostasy. And in apocalyptic terms, it's when the daily sacrifice, which is direct communal love feasts and raw spiritual ecstasy, was replaced by an imperial weaponized bureaucracy. The ecstatic witch's brew, or the shamanic sacrament, was demonized. Spiritual authority was stripped from the individual and given strictly to a state-sanctioned priest, distributing controlled portions of ordinary bread and wine. If you note, modern witches and the fear of all these evil witches and demons and possession and all this fear that we've talked about in the last 150 years has been spearheaded by groups like Seventh-day Adventist Jehovah's Witnesses. And Protestants would do some of that too. It was these groups weren't Christians. They've long since apostated. Catholics were closer to the truth than the Protestants. But then it got worse. Jehovah's Witnesses and Adventists came up with all this fear. You couldn't eat this, do that. Basically going back to the law, the principles of the law. And everybody was possessed, and anything that was holy we were told it was pagan. It was evil. It's something they did on purpose. So then we have this piece of history that we've mentioned. A descendant of King Jeconiah, or some call him Jehoiachin, from Baghdad. He married Charlemagne's aunt, and this is real. In the 8th century, the lay head of the Jewish community in Babylon, which then was Baghdad because Babylon was destroyed, but they were known as the Exilarch. It was a title that was reserved strictly for verified descendants of the house of David, King Jeconiah. Historical records do indicate that a prominent Babylonian scholar leader named Makar of Narbonne was sent by the Caliph of Baghdad to Charlemagne's kingdom. He was granted a noble title, and his bloodline heavily intertwined with the Charlemagne aristocracy. You can trace this hidden Davidic Babylonian lineage as the secret architectural force behind the Carolingian Empire and a medieval papacy, which created the elite dynastic bloodline to rule Europe under the guise of the Holy Roman Empire. Almost nobody knows this, but this is the truth. And we noticed that it was like a conceptual link between the Roman flamen, or the priests that were called the flamen, and the flames of fire at Pentecost. The parallel is striking. The Roman flamen wore a distinctive conical hat, a cone hat. It was called an apex. It mimicked the pointed cone of fire. And when the early church experienced the Holy Spirit at Pentecost as tongues of fire resting on their heads, it visually mirrored the ancient archetype of this priest crowned with this divine flame. So what we've said about these modern drug traffickers, drug enforcement, and how it stems from the Catholic Inquisition, bridges the past directly to the present. It is something that is continuing on. They're not telling us. Nobody knows we're living in a priest initiatory society were all being initiated into Satanism. The Cathars of southern France and the British esoteric groups were brutally suppressed by the Dominican inquisitors because they practiced their own versions of Gnosticism and communal living, bypassing the Catholic hierarchy. The inquisitors would act exactly like modern-day narcs. They used networks of secret informants, snooped around local villages looking for the unauthorized rituals, and busted up private gatherings under the guise of stopping witchcraft or demonic activity. So when the state and the church banned alternative sacraments, they drove these substances into the criminal underground. The transformation of the ancient herbal sacraments into illicit street drugs and the simultaneous creation of the specialized police forces to hunt them down is a direct cultural evolution of the medieval Inquisition, policing unauthorized spiritual states. So that's a fact. Now, the Babylonian exarch, the bloodline that he had, went into European royalty. Macher of Narbonne was a prominent 8th century Babylonian Jewish scholar, as we said, and a leader ruler. According to historical documents like Abraham ibn Dad's Sefer HaKabbalah, which means that they were very into Kabbalism, which is why I don't believe in Kabbalism. But they said, according to them, the Carolingian king Pepin the Short, and later his son Emperor Charlemagne, sent a request to the Abbasid Caliph at Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid. They requested a ruler of royal Davidic descent to govern the strategic newly conquered territory of Septimania, which is southern France, or the Languedoc area. They did that because they were trying to control the Knights of St. John. So they had a Jewish king. The Caliph sent Macher, also known as Macher ben Yehuda Zaki. He was a scion of the Babylonian exarchs from the exile. They were arcs or chiefs of the exile. The official lineage verified exile rulers descended directly from King Jehoiachin and the house of David. Charlemagne granted Macher massive tracts of land, feudal privileges, and the hereditary title of Nasi, prince. I still think this is where we get Nazism and NASA and the Ashkenazis, and all these words come from this Nasi. Leading locals, and it also means deception, by the way, in Hebrew. But it led the locals of that area to refer to his descendants as Jewish kings of Narbonne. So they infiltrated the Languedoc where Mary Magdalene's seed was. To bind the powerful Eastern lineage to the Western Empire, historical and genealogical theories, like the theory of Arthur Zuckerman, state that Macher was integrated into the Frankish nobility. Remember, that's the French, the ones that were in the northern part of France. The Languedoc, where Mary Magdalene's people were, was from Anjou in the middle of France down to the southern part. The northern part was ruled over by these Frankish individuals that came in to destroy. They were Goths. Their brother Goth had already taken Rome. And so the Frankish nobility tried through marriage to get rid of them. And so this Macher was identified with Theory 1, Count of Autun. He married Aude, the daughter of Charles Martel, and the aunt to Emperor Charlemagne. Through this union, the ancient Davidic bloodline of Babylon merged directly into the Carolingian Capetian lines of Europe. So Macher's son William of Gillon, William of Orange, became a legendary Frankish warrior and, ironically, a canonized Christian saint because they had already taken over the Catholic Church. So the exact text of the Theodosian Decree, the abolition of the mysteries, the great apostasy, The definitive outlawing of the original sacraments occurred through a series of laws issued by the Roman Emperor Theodosius I between 381 and 395, collectively known as the Theodosian Decrees, collected later in Book 16 of the Theodosian Code. These laws systematically criminalized the ancient world's direct spiritual channels. So now you understand that not only did the Jews take over London and the Bar Association, the whole world's under this black robe system of law, but they were doing this all the way back. And when they took over the Catholic Church, that's why it became like this with the Inquisitions. It was a trial, a hearing. These judges that wore these black robes were no longer priests of Christ. So, 3 specific decrees represent the literal putting out of the flame. Decree of February 24, 391 AD, Codex Theodosian 16:10:10. This decree banned the core physical acts of the ancient mysteries, turning temples into state property. It criminalized lookouts, initiates, and priests. And this was it. Quote, "No person shall grant himself the permission to perform sacrifices. No person shall go around the temples. No person shall rever shrines. Everyone shall know that access to holy places is forbidden by our law. And if anyone attempts anything regarding the deities or sacred rites, he shall be punished." Then we have the decree of June 16, 391 AD, Codex Theodosius 16:10:11. It said, quote, "No person shall look at statues made of the hand of men, nor enter temples, nor witness sacrifices. Governors of provinces shall enforce this, and if anyone enters a temple for ritual, they shall pay a heavy fine of gold immediately," unquote. Then the final blow, November 8, 392 AD, Codex Theodosius 16:10:12. The law officially criminalized all private, localized household spirituality, which included herbal potions, household shrines, and indigenous sacraments. It is the historical birth of the anti-witchcraft and the anti-drug policing matrix. No person shall honor the household deities with fire, wine, or fragrant odors. If anyone should dare to offer this or prepare these substances, he shall be accused of treason and suffer the maximum penalty even if he did nothing against the emperor, unquote. So centuries after Rome crushed the initial Gnostics, the Cathars, or the bony Homines, which is the good men, they reemerged in southern France and northern Italy. They rejected the Catholic Church entirely, called the Pope the agent of the devil, and they viewed the Catholic Mass, tithes, and baptism as corrupt tools of physical entrapment. The Cathars threw out all the Catholic sacraments and replaced them with just one single ultimate rite, the Consolamentum. According to the surviving text, like the Lyon Occitane ritual, the ceremony was strikingly simple, entirely bypassing physical substances like water, holy oil, entirely bypassing physical substances like water, holy oils, or fermented wine. They got rid of the idea of drinking wine in their sacrament. They did believe in baptism in pure spirit and fire, they said. The believers gathered in a plain room with a table covered in a white cloth, and the parfait, which is the perfect, or the elders, they held the Gospel of John over the initiate's head. The elders placed their hands upon the initiate. They believed this triggered the immediate descent of the Holy Spirit, which they believed was Sophia, or wisdom, directly into the person's physical body. And then the Consolamentum forgave all sins, broke the cycle of reincarnation, and reunited the person's trapped spark within the true divine. So once an initiate received the Consolamentum, they became a perfect, or they had become perfect in Christ. They had to live a life of complete asceticism, absolute vegetarianism, and they had to work with their own hands. they couldn't be a slave for others. They achieved direct gnosis through the Holy Spirit, and they didn't ever go to a Catholic priest. They thought that was wrong, and they didn't believe in the Pope or the church building to speak to deity. They worshipped in the mountains, in the holy groves. This directly threatened the Vatican's financial monopoly on salvation, obviously, and so in response, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in the year of 1209. That created the Dominican Inquisition, specifically to hunt down the perfects or the parfaits. The Inquisition narcs flooded southern France, the police, the inquisitors, searching the village for anyone who had secretly received the consolamentum, and ultimately burning thousands at the stake to preserve the imperial banking and religious system of the Catholics. The birth of the banking system then happened. So this was actually the birth of the banking system. No man can buy or sell without the mark, you see. There are stages to this. We're going into the final stage now of the Great Tribulation, where there will be an actual Antichrist fully, completely fulfilling all these prophecies. But the merging of centralized money with the suppression of the direct spiritual access did not happen in one day, but they did it through major historical dates. 325, the Council of Nicaea. That's when they, merged the Roman state administrative power with the Christian church. And then they made a decree, established a strict top-down hierarchy, the bishop, the patriarchs, the Roman emperor. And then it made salvation dependent on the state-authorized priest, bypassing the hierarchy to speak directly to deity through prophecy, dreams, or personal gnosis. You weren't allowed to do that. It was illegal. It was treason against both the church and the empire. So then in 380, Thessalonica, there was the Edict of Thessalonica, the mandatory contract. Emperor Theodosius I Gratian and Valentinian II made the Nicene Catholicism only legal religion of the Roman Empire. Completely outlawed the economic freedom of non-Catholic spiritual groups. Temples were confiscated, communal assets were stolen by the state, the church was granted total tax-exempt status. This laid the foundation for the church to act as Europe's largest landholder and economic monopoly. Then in 529, Justinian Code, which was the finalization of faith, their faith, he updated the Roman law to completely bind the church to civil and financial law. So, officially, he stripped all the civil rights from the heretics and the pagans, or the witches. They could not inherit money, own land, or buy or sell goods or testify in court. So, this is the true birth of the theocratic banking matrix. And you had to submit to the Catholic priest for access to the divine, or you were completely locked out economically, and you could not survive or participate in commerce. Same thing they're going to be doing now. It's going to be on a wider scale. It's like they think they're really going to go for it here. We're about to get to that point. But the Cathar had a sacrament, a sacred meal as well. And their consolamentum, while the consolamentum was spiritual, it was a substance-free baptism. They did have sacred daily meals. They rejected the Catholic Mass. They avoided and completely rejected fermented grape wine or animal flesh. They used plain bread and pure water, no wine or no fruit juice, in some of their meals. But they did use herbs that they infused with this wild honey that we'll talk about. And they laid a white cloth on the table, recited the Pater Noster, our Father, blessed the bread, broke it, and distributed it to the believers. So for their daily meals, they just had the bread and vegetables and water with no wine at all. They didn't believe in the transubstantiation of the Catholic Church, where the food turned to the body of Christ or anything like that. They were strictly vegetarian. They didn't eat dairy either. Only fish and bees they could partake of their, like the bees' honey, and they could partake of fish because they had some little story where they told that fish didn't have sex and bees didn't have sex, so they could partake of it. But any animal that had sex, they couldn't partake of anything on that animal. Now, this is symbolic, and we'll get into what it means. It's not literal. They weren't that stupid. But it miraculously allowed them to eat the fish and the honey that Jesus gave his disciples on the road to Emmaus, where their eyes were opened. So, in the ancient Greek Anatolian mystery schools up in Turkey, today we call it Turkey, they were run on this bee symbolism, that Artemis temple in Ephesus. It's the city where the ecstatic speaking happened, the Glossolalia, and the high priestesses were called Melissae, or honeybees. The priests that were serving there were Essenes, that's what they called them, which means a king drone. They practiced absolute celibacy, or a type of celibacy. We don't know what they really were doing because they called them eunuchs. And we'll get into what that word means. And these virgins, they weren't really virgins either, were they? They did some other kind of sacrament. We're not sure, but we're going to talk about that at some point. They did have communal living. I don't believe they were complete celibate in the sense that they just abstained from any kind of sex. However, they didn't believe in bringing children into the world because they thought this world was too evil to bring children into this classroom where they would learn evil. So, ancient Gnosticism believed that honey was the symbol of gnosis. It never spoiled, honey never spoils or decays. In Luke 24:42, when Jesus appears to his disciples and eats a piece of broiled fish and a honeycomb, they took note of that. And so other esoteric groups, like these Cathars, their meal was a code. The fish represented the soul pulled from the waters of illusion, and the honeycomb represented the sweet, perfectly structured hexagon architecture of cosmic truth. The Cathars didn't have written records openly using the words Kykeon or Melissae because the Inquisition burned their books. We don't know if they even use those words. However, spiritually and structurally, they did carry out the exact same flame and the same herbs and the same the sacred honey, and they had sacred bees and all that, just like up at Artemis. So we know they did the same thing. The Cathars emerged out of the Balkan Bogomile movement, which also itself inherited the hidden underground Gnostic traditions of Thrace and Greece and Anatolia, where the Cathars wore the white robes, lived in absolute celibacy. Like I said, that's not necessarily what it was. We'll get into what it was. They broke bread over white tablecloths, rejected, and that's funny how early Christian, Americans in early times when we were, I think it came from Britain, England, our standards, our culture. And those were Huguenots. They'd fled from these traditions. And they always had tablecloths, white, clean tablecloths. And they would always use white aprons and white robes, when they cooked and things like this. It's traditions based on these ancient traditions. So they never believed in the animal sacrifices. They didn't believe in the law. So they acted as if they were direct cultural, spiritual descendants of the ancient Melissae, these Knights of St. John, the Cathars. They acted like they were just the same religion as up there at Ephesus. And they were from there. Now think about this. they're all interrelated. Same people. There's different stories about how they settled. Mary went there and then ended up going somewhere else, up into Britain and who knows where. But Martha ended up going up into northern Italy, and she brought with her a group of them, and they were up in Italy. So they knew about the Kykeon, but it's not mentioned in their books because we don't have any books because they burned them all in the Catholic Inquisitions. All we can do is surmise that they held the same sacred views as the teachings at Athens, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Dionysian mysteries, and the Pythagorean mysteries, and the Temple of Artemis, and Heliopolis in Egypt. But the Catholics understood and they knew that this was unauthorized. This pure bee-like collective religion where they had all things common, produced their own spiritual honey without paying a single tax to the Roman banking system was very much frowned on. The historical records of both the Cathars and the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, which is what they were also called, reveal that the herbal medicine and the honeyed infusions were central to their survival. So they did believe in this mad honey, or this, well, there's actually a difference between mad honey from the rhododendron and the honey that you get from the daffodil, which is a type of herb or drink that gave you waking vision so that you could go out of your body and go wherever you could possibly want to go and talk to deity or the angels or faraway places. So they used the same honey-infused drinks that the Artemis temples used. And the Cathars used and the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, used them in modern chemical pharmacology. That's in a kind of medicine. So they relied completely on the plant kingdom for their food. They used herbs, teas. The Occitan, or the Languedoc area of southern France, was very rich in these herbs. The records that we do have about the Cathars and the elders, that they were sought after by their medical knowledge. They understood certain things that you could do with herbs and making the potions. This is why the Catholic Church said they were witches making potions with black robes. So they always brewed their teas using wild thyme honey. They put the honey in the tea, rosemary, mint, sage, and melissa, and they used lemon balm, which I have that here in my yard. I like that. And they didn't drink Kykeon by name, that the same thing that they drank up in Greece, but basically the botanical framework of Kykeon, barley, water infused with these herbs, was a standard medieval pleasant drink known for its tisane, or barley water infused drink. And the Cathar perfects traveled extensively on foot. They fasted a lot, survived on simple grains mixed with water and crushed cooling herbs and honey. The Cathars said that honey is a plant product. It is produced by bees because the Cathars said that bees did not reproduce sexually. So they viewed the bees as spiritually pure. Same thing with the fish. But that's not really true. Bees do have some kind of sexuality. But I guess, it's probably different than other animals who have sex. And they only have the one queen, so it's a little different. The Knights, or Hospitallers, began as a religious order dedicated to running an advanced hospital. And then they moved to Rhodes and Malta. They were literal pioneers of medicine. And they utilized honey heavily in the herbal teas. Honey was the foundational ingredient in the Knights Temple herbs and their healing arts. At their grand hospital in Valletta, Malta, the knights would use thousands of pounds of honey annually. They formulated oxymel, a very potent medicinal drink made by boiling honey in some kind of vinegar, and it had some specific therapeutic healing effect. They used different medicines that they coined, that they discovered, but their main thing was this honey. But here's the other thing that they did. You ever heard of St. John's wort? Well, the reason it's called St. John's wort is because it's one of their main herbs, and it's a yellow flower. So it was named after St. John because it traditionally blooms around June 24th, the feast of St. John the Baptist. The knights used the herb very extensively. They infused it into olive oil or honey to heal wounds. So they put the St. John's wort in the honey. Now, this is the thing that it's going to blow your mind. St. John's wort, when it's in the honey, and when they add some little mixture of things that they put in there, it would turn blood red. They put it on wounds, soothed burns, and it got rid of depression. So they drank it, and it made them, it said that the light would come on, and they would be happy, and they would have good spirits. It was like getting rid of the demons. They believed that negativity that was in people was demonic control. And these herbs and eating properly the fresh fruits and vitamins and nutrients gave a person health. So they revered the plant, the St. John's wort, because the plant's yellow petals deeply bleed a deep red oil when they're crushed, and the Cathars and the Gnostics that lived there viewed it as a symbol of divine light. The Cathars, who lived in the southern France of the Languedoc, where St. Anthony's fire occurred, that's a mass hallucination of burning sensations that was caused by eating the ergot in the grain. This is something in history. So it was very well known, this ergot in the area. The Cathars consumed a diet of only whole grains, nuts, berries, and honey, and fish and water. That's all they ate. And they were very aware of the mind-altering power of infected rye and barley. So they knew all about it, and they used it. The Knights of St. John studied the fungal outbreaks. They used the fermented grain not only for getting rid of depression, as they claimed, and this is just the way they explained it to others because they couldn't tell all these deep truths. So they just said, oh, well, it gets rid of depression, gets rid of the demons. The perfect, or the Parfaits, or the Gnostics, practice a advanced spiritual technique. This is what we're talking about earlier. Mainstream inquisitors accuse them of being prudes or secret homosexuals. That's what they were accused of. But their traditions do not point to that. It points towards some form of maybe a tantric celibacy. What does that mean? We're not quite sure. They believed that standard reproductive sex was a trap created by the demiurge to get more people down in here under these circumstances. In this kingdom, because of the apostasy, spirits shouldn't be coming down here getting bodies anymore. That's why we've got to end this system and start over. Because the reason for this world is to bring bodies into the world and have them taught what the purpose of life is. So, if there was any sex in their group, it was some kind of internal energetic union. But we don't know what they did because they didn't write down a lot of what they did. But they mixed the masculine and the feminine energies with some somehow within themselves to trigger some kind of gnosis or this spirit that gave them life. And it bypassed the physical reproduction system. Because they could not father children. So then we go to this idea of the eunuchs. Eunuchs were used, as well as these virgins, in these temple priesthoods. They couldn't father children because they were eunuchs. Some of them just didn't want to father children. They were gay. Well, we don't know, but that's what some of these eunuchs were. We know that. Maybe not all of them. Some of them, Jesus said some are born eunuchs and some were made that way for the kingdom. So we don't really know what all this means. But we can deduce something here. Now, when you look at what they had, and not so much whether or not we know exactly what they were doing, but what did they have? Well, they had virgins and they had eunuchs. Well, now, isn't it interesting? Because go back up where they had Melissae, women priests. And then they had what they called Essenes, which were male priests. So they had two different names, but one was male, one was female. So we know what virgins were. They seemed all to be women. You never hear about any virgin men, right? Maybe there were. Oh, yes, there were. Okay, well, what were they called? Because they weren't called virgins, they were called eunuchs. So you say, well, what kind of people would, why did Jesus say, to become a eunuch for the kingdom, right? Just cut off your wee. No. It was just like we were talking about with the Nazirite vow. You shaved your head when you're done, and then you could drink wine or eat flesh again. But it was temporary vows. Some did it their entire lives, permanently. But most people just did it for a little vow here and there for a week or a month or whatever. And so in this analogy here, what we have is eunuchs and virgins. Well, the virgins, I think they would serve for like 7 years or something. I don't really remember, 10 years, I'm not sure. And at the end of that time, they retire and then they can get married. In fact, in some cases, these individuals were preferred. And so by the time they get out, I think they had it's like the military. You build up money when you get out, you get all this money. I mean, because they don't have anything to spend it on when they're official. They take care of all their expenses. So they made a lot of money. It was just so many years they served. And then when they got out, they were almost like royalty because these were priests. So that's what I think eunuchs were. I think they were individuals that did not have children. They didn't get married. Remain as I am, Paul says. Right? Does that mean that they all were just forever without a spouse? No, these individuals would take on a vow of poverty for periods of time. Most people never did it that long. In fact, if you did 10 years, man, that was a great service to your country. People didn't do this for the rest of their lives. There were very few that did, and they ended up becoming the popes or whatever. Samuel and Samson and King David and things like this. So there were groups like the Galli, which were the eunuch priests of Sibyl. Now remember, the Sibylline oracles were used and read and believed on by early Christians. They were Essenes, and they had the same belief about these eunuchs. The Essenes of Ephesus castrated themselves or swore absolute celibacy. They believed that shutting down the physical sperm-egg reproduction redirected the biological energy upward to the brain, and it induced permanent states of ecstasy and prophecy and vision. And they used these herbs. But I hate to stop here. I mean, we're right in the middle of it. We're about to get to some really, really, really fascinating information. But I'm going to have to do that in the next video, guys. We're way too far over. So I'm going to have to leave it there and bid you adieu and hope you have a wonderful evening, because the Lord loves you all very much. His grace and his peace will always be with you. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.